Gaudeamus omnes in Domino.
I am going the way of the fathers, for I see myself being summoned by the Lord.
Sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers, a podcast sponsored by CatholicCulture.org. I'm your host, Mike Aquilina. In our last two episodes, we learned about Origen of Alexandria. Today we turn to a man of a very different cast of mind. His name was Lucius Caecilius Firmianus Lactantius, and he was from Roman North Africa. While Origen's language was Greek, Lactantius wrote in Latin. Origen was a high flyer, with an intellect capable of stunning speculation. Lactantius preferred to work in more pedestrian modes, such as apologetics and history. But he excelled his contemporaries, both Christian and pagan, in one thing, and that was rhetoric. His work earned him the nickname of the Christian Cicero. North Africa, as we have seen in past episodes, was a great center of literary activity in the Roman Empire. It was a vast region, whose lands fall today within the borders of Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya. African culture was deeply influential in the empire's distant capital. From Carthage and the surrounding lands came many of the leading lights of Latin literature: the poet Claudian, the playwright Terence, the scientist Ptolemy, and the novelist Apuleius. Africans dominated many of the prestigious professions. Juvenal referred to the African province as the foster mother of lawyers. We know nothing about the early life of Lactantius. The first fact we can determine is that he received his rhetorical training from Arnobius the Elder in the city of Sika, which is today called El Kef and located in northwestern Tunisia. At the time, both the teacher and his student were traditional citizens who offered sacrifice to the Roman gods and excelled in their profession. While still very young, Lactantius published his Symposium, which was a collection of 100 riddles, and he also composed a book-length travelogue in verse, recounting his journey from North Africa to the city of Nicomedia, which was then the administrative center of the empire. That was a journey that would have a profound effect on his subsequent life. Lactantius had been summoned to the eastern capital to serve there as professor of Latin rhetoric. The appointment speaks to the positive reception of his early works, and also to his international reputation. It was an achievement and an honor to hold such a chair so close to the seat of power. It was the end of the 3rd century, and power had begun to shift eastward. The lands of the empire had grown too vast and unwieldy to be governed efficiently from a single capital so far to the west. So in 285, the Emperor Diocletian had begun his grand experiment of dividing the empire in two, each half with its own rulers. Diocletian himself ruled the east from Nicomedia. Lactantius was surely flattered by the invitation. He made the journey. But once established in the capital, he found himself with little to do. Nicomedia was a Greek city, and its inhabitants had little use for training in Latin rhetoric. With so much time on his hands, Lactantius took to writing, and he tended to write long. At some point, too, we don't know when, he converted to Christianity. In his youth, Christianity was enjoying a brief spell of toleration. The ruling classes held it in disdain, and intellectuals dismissed it as a superstition, but in general, the anti-Christian laws were not enforced. That brief respite came to an end while Lactantius was at court in Nicomedia. One day in the year 299, the emperor was consulting with the priests of the gods for the purpose of predicting the future. The priests would customarily sacrifice an animal and then search its entrails for a sign. On that day, however, they repeatedly offered sacrifice and repeatedly received no message from the gods. Diocletian grew impatient and asked what the problem was. The priests told him that the presence of Christians was obstructing the rituals. Lactantius may have been there in the room where it happened. In one of his books, he describes the scene in great detail. Diocletian flew into a rage and ordered everyone in the palace, from the greatest to the least, to join the sacrifice. Those who refused would be scourged. From that day forward, Diocletian and his second in command, Galerius, began to remove Christians from any positions of influence. Through the time of toleration, there had been Christians at court and at all lower levels of government. There was, in fact, a large Christian church just across the street from the imperial palace. The persecution began with the demolition of that church. While Diocletian watched from a tower of his palace, soldiers invaded the church and burned the scriptures they found inside. They would have immolated the church itself, but worried that the fire would spread to consume the city, so they took it down with axes instead. And with so many soldiers, it didn't take long. Lactantius stepped down from his official position, which was no longer open to a Christian man. He lived afterward in dire poverty. But in the years that followed, he wrote the works that won him his reputation as the Christian Cicero. It was common for philosophers to deny the goodness of the human body, and they were joined in this error even by some wayward Christians who spoke of the body as a prison for the soul. Against these body haters and body shamers, Lactantius wrote a book celebrating the physical form of humans. It bore the title On the Workmanship of God, and it praised the arrangement and the purposefulness of the body's limbs and organs and senses. From these he deduced an argument for the wisdom and benevolence of God. It was a rapturous praise of the physicality of human life. Listen to just a sample. God therefore connected and bound together the parts which strengthen the body, which we call bones, being knotted and joined to one another by sinews, which the mind might make use of as bands, if it should wish to hasten forward or to lag behind. And indeed without any labor or effort, but with a very slight inclination, it might moderate and guide the mass of the whole body. But he covered these with the inward organs, as was befitting to each place, that the parts which were solid might be enclosed and concealed. Also, he mixed with the inward organs veins like streams divided through the whole body, through which the moisture and the blood, running in different directions, might bedew all the limbs with the vital juices. Lactantius was one of the most respected poets and rhetoricians of his time, and here he placed the entirety of his gift in service of the praise of the Creator God. During the years of persecution, he produced other books. He wrote one on the wrath of God, defending Christian doctrine against pagans who mocked it as primitive. How can God grow angry, they said, if he never changes? How can God suffer emotions if he is a pure spirit without a body? Lactantius explained that wrath is the name we give to the exercise of God's justice. He showed furthermore that God's justice is one with his beneficence, and it is all manifest for the good of his creatures. Around the same time, he produced his most famous work, the Divine Institutes, which he composed as a summary of Christian doctrine. It begins by dismantling Christianity's rivals in philosophy and religion. Lactantius examines the various myths and schools of thought, pointing out their inconsistencies and impossible claims. He follows this with a systematic exposition of the claims of Christianity. It was a most useful book to have in a time of persecution. Lactantius provided both negative arguments against the persecutors, but also positive arguments in favor of the faith. The demand for the book must have been phenomenal, for he soon followed up with a condensed version, which would have been more accessible and affordable in those years before the printing press. In all his books, Lactantius showed a profound familiarity with the various schools of contemporary philosophy and religion. He moved easily from the Epicureans to the Stoics, and then to the oracles of pagan divination. He took great care to cite sources that would be recognized and respected by pagan intellectuals. He was writing apologetics aimed specifically at those of his class and educational level. He himself had been persuaded. In fact, by this time, his teacher, Arnobius, had also been persuaded, and both he and his teacher believed that many more of their peers could follow them into the church. They believed this even in the midst of the last and bloodiest and most thoroughgoing of all the Roman persecutions. The Holocaust, begun by Diocletian, raged for more than a decade, and it produced many martyrs, thousands of martyrs perhaps. All bad things, however, must come to an end, and so did the reign of Diocletian. The persecution continued for a time under his protege, Galerius, but in the West, the throne was seized in 312 by a man Lactantius probably knew quite well. His name was Constantine, and he was known to be friendly to Christians. Constantine credited his victory, in fact, to a miraculous intervention by the God of the Christians. In 313, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which officially ended the persecution and gave Christians legal status everywhere in the empire. Other favorable legal actions would follow. Constantine liberated Christian citizens from the persecution they had suffered intermittently for well over 200 years. Eventually, he embraced Christianity himself and showed favor to the church in many ways. But in no way did Constantine punish those who worshipped the traditional Roman gods. Instead, he insisted, quote, that every man must have complete toleration in the practice of whatever worship he has chosen, unquote. Constantine enshrined in law for the first time in history the idea of freedom of conscience, the idea of religious liberty. He made it his law, but he did not invent the idea. It is quite likely that he learned it from Lactantius. It was Lactantius, after all, who had written most forcefully, quote, "Religion cannot be compelled. It is by words rather than wounds that you must bend the will. Nothing is so much a matter of free will as religion," unquote. As I mentioned earlier, Constantine and Lactantius probably knew one another from their days in Nicomedia. It is telling that Constantine, soon after seizing the imperial purple, summoned Lactantius from the east to serve as tutor for his son. In the proclamations of Constantine, many historians discern the echoes of the Christian Cicero. Constantine enacted religious liberty, but he didn't invent it. The idea first emerged in the apologetic writings of Justin Martyr. It was developed further in the works of Tertullian. But the idea reached a ready audience through the writings of Lactantius, and so it entered history. Through the centuries, when statesmen and theologians revisited the idea, they reread Lactantius. We know nothing about the man's final years. Within the church, he was not much read after his death. His prose works are delightful to read. Their style is sparkling, but they're doctrinally messy and imprecise, and occasionally downright wrong. They were surpassed in every way by writers of the generations that followed, generations that lived in a peace won for them by the arguments of Lactantius. His poems, however, found a lasting readership and were enjoyed well into the Middle Ages. If today you're enjoying a good measure of religious liberty, you should thank Lactantius. Lactantius is the first father we've considered who witnessed the Great Transition. In the course of his adult life, he saw the church move from persecution to imperial favor. In our next episode, we'll meet another transitional figure as we go back to Egypt, and we'll spend some time there with St. Anthony of the Desert. In the meantime, I ask that you please consider making a contribution for the continuation of this podcast series. We're listener-funded, so we're dependent on the support of people like you. Please pay us a visit at catholicculture.org/donate/audio and let us know that you love the Fathers. We pray for our benefactors every day.
Decorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is just one of the podcasts produced by CatholicCulture.org. To hear more from the Church Fathers in their own words, check out Catholic Culture audiobooks, readings of Catholic classics, including the Fathers and St. John Henry Newman. You might also enjoy Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. It's a film club devoted to works of high artistic caliber and Catholic interest. And for interviews on a wide range of topics in Catholic arts and culture, listen to the Catholic Culture Podcast.